Good evening, mesdames et messieurs. I hope you're doing well this evening. I am Greg Kennedy. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, and it's my privilege to welcome you this evening to the gathering space at the library. So big thanks to Melanie and her team for hosting this event. We respectfully acknowledge that BU is located on the traditional homelands of the Dakota, Anishinaabe, Oji-Cree, Cree, Dene, and Métis peoples. And I'll just add the remark that we're called in this to be in right relationship with each other and the land. And part of that is to create space for open and respectful exchange and dialogue and ideas. And that's really what it's all about here tonight in sharing some innovative and very new hot off the press research. In terms of the format for tonight, so once I'm done talking, I'll turn it over to our author and person of the hour. So let me introduce first Dr. Jonathan Allan, who is the Canada Research Chair in Men and Masculinities, Professor of English, Drama, and Creative Writing, as well as in our Gender and Women's Studies program at BU. He is also the author of Reading from Behind, a Cultural Analysis of the Anus, which was also published by the University of Regina Press in 2016, and more recently, Men, Masculinities, and Infertilities, which was in the Routledge book series on masculinity, sex, and popular culture. And I gather from my conversations with Jonathan that he's also got some current and ongoing research in censorship and obscenity, and also something I would like to know more about at some point. He's reading some Latin American novels about dictators and the representation of masculinities in that context. So that sounds pretty fascinating as well. So today we're going to hear more about his latest book, and I hope you will all get a copy and get him to sign it. And we're here, we're here to celebrate you, frankly, Jonathan. These events of book launches are wonderful moments to come together with colleagues and friends and community. And if I can allow myself, you are also symbolic of the broader Faculty of Arts. This is not the first book launch we've had this year. More are planned in the winter. There is a lot of really exciting stuff going on. And you're a really great example of that. So thank you. We've got some great speakers and things to talk about today. I'm going to shut up and give the microphone to Dr. Jonathan Allan.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you for coming to this book launch. In many ways, this book has taken a long time to write and to come out. I began writing it shortly after I began my Canada Research Chair here at Brandon University in 2014, and now it's finally out. But before I speak about the book proper, I want to begin by noting the importance of libraries, and perhaps most especially our own library, for my research, and I assume for most research. This book took a long time because I am, as I like to say, a terrible researcher, by which I mean I want to read everything before I write anything. And I am a collector of materials. In my office and lab, which have become a kind of phallus palace, I have collected materials ranging from medical textbooks to magazine articles, artifacts to photographs, films, you name it. And I've been able to acquire a lot of this through used bookstores, but much of it was not easy to locate. Oftentimes, only a few known libraries have the material, even to this date. So thankfully, at Brandon University, we have some of the best folks I know working in the Interlibrary Loans Office, and this project has significantly benefited from their kindness and assistance. And that support, their support and labor should not be underestimated in the production of research. I can't do it alone. I need a library that helps me. And I can truly say that everyone here has been supportive in this regard. We have a small but mighty library here at BU. Research happens at universities because libraries, special collections, and archives continue to support researchers. Researchers depend upon libraries, special collections, and archives, which are absolutely essential to the preservation of knowledge. Indeed, like Jorge Luis Borges, I imagine that paradise will be a kind of library, and I cannot help but think that we might have a small piece of paradise here. And I'm glad we're doing this in the library tonight. So the backstory to Uncut is a fairly normal one, I think. I received a peer reviewer comment that simply confounded me. It seemed to come out of nowhere. Reviewer 2. I was asked something about circumcision, and if I recall correctly, it had absolutely nothing to do with the article I'd submitted. So I probably quickly dismissed it, did the typical academic thing and said, oh, that's an interesting point. I'll have to think about that later. But it stuck with me. It bothered me. And I kept wondering about it. Why would a reviewer ask about that? And so carefully, I walked around the proverbial rabbit hole. But without sufficient care, like Alice, I fell down the rabbit hole into the wonderland of foreskin and circumcision. Writing about circumcision and the foreskin is not easy because it seems we all have opinions about it. And moreover, it is deeply implicated in religious and cultural debates. In our current moment of rampant anti-Semitism, it is particularly important to be attuned to these debates. Throughout Uncut, I am writing a study of the secular, not religious practice of circumcision, focusing on secular understandings of the foreskin. In the book, I write, my point is not one of religious argument, but one of focusing on the secular foreskin. In terms of theologies and religions, I agree with David Morgan, who argues in his book, Visual Piety, that people are entitled to the theologies they choose, and I am neither qualified nor interested in changing their minds. End quote. I'm not arguing about whether or not circumcision is appropriate to someone's belief systems, but rather arguing instead that a focus on the foreskin might afford new perspectives, ideas, and thoughts, and those may in turn cause reflection. Of course, there are already sufficient arguments and debates on both sides of the circumcision debate within those religious traditions. And I note this here because I think it's very easy for arguments to be made in Uncut to be misread, to be misunderstood in the service of not only anti-Semitism, but also Islamophobia, particularly given the vast majority of Islamic men would be circumcised. And that's not my point, and that's not my goal. And I would be absolutely horrified if that's what it were used for. So against this backdrop, then, I want to welcome you to the Foreskin Archive, which was the original and perhaps horribly academic title for this book. We likely all have an idea about what an archive is, a collection of documents pertaining to a given subject. But what kinds of subjects are endowed with or afforded an archive? The title was a placeholder that I used because I was spending so much of my time in archives at various universities and museums, and because I imagined the book responding to Jacques Derrida's question, is circumcision, for example, an exterior mark? Is it an archive? What caught my attention was not the specificity of the debate. Derrida is responding to Freud's civilization and discontents, and particularly Freud's worry, which Derrida sees as a useless expenditure that could easily be removed, but rather the connection between foreskin and archives. What would it mean for a foreskin or its removal to be a kind of archive? Derrida explains, inscribing inscription, it commemorates in its way, effectively a circumcision, a very singular moment. It is also the document of an article. In a reiterated manner, it leaves the trace of an incision right on the skin. Circumcision as both a ritual and repetition becomes what Derrida calls the archive of a singular private inscription. And yet, of course, we must ask, or at least we may ask, another question of Derrida. Where is the foreskin, then, in this archive? It is worth noting here that circumcision cuts around the word specifically, but the word specifically erases what it cut away from the penis and what is removed in the cutting, namely the foreskin. In other words, what happens to the remains of that singular private inscription? And it was this idea of the remainder that provoked the book. We spend so much critical and cultural energy on its removal, debating its ethics, morality, religiosity, that it seemed to me we had lost sight of the foreskin itself. And so I began crafting, cultivating, and curating the Foreskin Archive. I intentionally sought out and collected information on the foreskin. I signed up for Google alerts about the foreskin. I traced, tracked, and stalked quotations. Each new article was a clue to an earlier article. I collected items such as beads from New Orleans, which were surprisingly uncut, statues such as a replica of the David, photographs and posters, quotations and jokes, anecdotes and stories. The bookcases in my office became lined with books about the penis, parenting, pornography, all of which in some fashion or another address the foreskin. One journalist, upon learning of the project from a university press release, quickly asked me, well, what does a foreskin archive look like? Presumably, the journalist imagined I had amassed a collection of foreskins like the biblical David, who in Samuel is said to have brought back the foreskins of 200 slain Philistines to Saul as a kind of bride price for Saul's daughter. This, however, was not my goal. Instead, I had imagined the archive as a kind of expansive and almost limitless space in which to do my research, a perhaps narrower and more specialized version of the Icelandic Phallological Museum. I did not want to cut off, as it were, fields of study. Of course, as is often the case with the archive as a method, the information simply became too much. Like David, I had brought back twice what was required of me. The penis, of which the foreskin is a part, has been extensively studied, represented, theorized, and critiqued. When I started work in the archive, for example, at the Kinsey Institute, I began with the larger object, the penis, in order to find information on the foreskin. I had to seek out the foreskin. But I found it in scholarly monographs, novels, articles, dissertations, songs, movies, poems, memoirs, and more. As Mels van Driel has written, penises were worshipped in ancient religions, then demonized by the church fathers, secularized by learned anatomists and physiologists like Da Vinci, De Graaf, and van Leeuwenhoek, and then for a while subjected to psychoanalysis by Freud. The noble parts have been through quite a lot. After being praised to the sky by psychologists, abused by feminists, and shamefully exploited by pop culture in the 21st century, they are in danger of becoming totally medicalized. In these sentences, Van Driel proposes a history of and a way to historicize the penis, that appendage that has occupied human attention for millennia. It is worthy of study, he argues, if for no other reason than the outsized space it occupies in social, religious, scientific, cultural, and intellectual histories. But what, I wondered again, of the foreskin? The foreskin is a key part of the penis even if removed, and its removal creates a different kind of penis, one that is debated, historicized, theorized, fetishized, idolized, and perhaps even idolized, as well as demonized. So throughout this study, I draw on a significant archive of materials that are not limited to one genre, one disciplinary tradition, one medium. Thus, entering this archive, which is less, of course, a physical space and more an idea, an explorer might find material on the foreskin that is popular, scientific, artistic, religious. While I read an article, or read a magazine article about the foreskin, for instance, I also had at hand visual materials related to it. My approach is one I attempt to replicate here in order to ensure that we cover as much intellectual and cultural terrain as possible. Fully understanding the foreskin is not possible within a single discipline. It requires bringing together a range of disciplinary traditions, texts, and archives. To analyze and study the foreskin requires a capacious approach that incorporates gender studies, most obviously the critical studies of men and masculinity, psychoanalysis and psychology, religious studies, the biomedical sciences, HIV/AIDS research, sexuality studies, anthropology and ethnography, sociology, historical studies, literary and cultural studies, visual culture, and many others. My goal then was to create this working archive, which would then enable a greater understanding, I imagined, of the foreskin, working between and through both the official archives of, say, the biomedical sciences and the unofficial archives of, say, sex manuals, pregnancy and child-rearing books, anecdotes, jokes, and testimonies. Uncut provides an implicit and explicit critique of the archive and how archives are used and constructed. Foreskins are often represented and debated in pornographic magazines, for instance, but few libraries, including our own, collect this material because the material is deemed, for whatever reason, inappropriate to a collection or perhaps even to a serious study. Thus, the need to think about a private archive for the research. One reason for the exclusion of the erotic or the pornographic from libraries may well be the visual nature of the medium, but when I turned to the biomedical material, I often found images equally compelling, such as the case of one man who sought to remove his own foreskin. I found myself working not against the library and the archive, but rather between them. often expanding the scope of my analysis because I needed different sets of materials to understand the foreskin. Thus, to build on our understanding of foreskin, I'm as likely to draw on a book like Hot Sex, How to Do It, as I am an ethnographic study of cosmetic and elective circumcision in Japan. So when I started writing and researching this book, I began, as scholars so often do, with what seemed like those logical sites of inquiry. EBSCOhost, other scholarly databases, yielding various studies of the foreskin and HIV, for instance. Very quickly, I realized the bulk of the studies on the foreskin were about its removal, why it is removed, and why it ought to be removed. One scientist, Brian Morris, calls circumcision a biomedical imperative, while others compare the foreskin to a piece of prehistoric history out of which we should have evolved. And I was intrigued at the level of the language. What does it mean that circumcision is a biomedical imperative? Is the foreskin really part of some primitive past, an evolutionary failure that must be removed for humans to evolve? Thus, I began to search out traces of the foreskin both abroad and closer to home, in spaces both scholarly and very much not so scholarly. Amsterdam, for instance, is home to both the National Rijksmuseum and the Sex Museum on the Damrak, near the red light district. Both were necessary to understanding how and why the foreskin inscribes and is ascribed meaning, from the marble sculptures populating the Rijksmuseum to the animatronic flasher at the Sex Museum. So, from the British Library and the Wellcome Collection to the Kinsey Institute, from the Gerber Hart Library and the Archives, to the Leather Archives and Museum in Chicago, I went searching for traces of the foreskin, both present and absent. Interlibrary loans arrived from around the world, bringing me sources from public libraries locally, as well as from the Library of Congress. Information about foreskin seemed to come from all directions. As I searched for information in medical textbooks, I read up on religious debates and pored through sex manuals, scientific studies, blogs, parenting books, pornography, erotica, fine arts, popular arts, everything from scholarly books to self-published. Truth be told, to answer the journalist's question about the archive, it now spans several bookcases in my office and about a dozen banker boxes of ephemera. In this book and in my research more broadly, I understand this archive as any mechanism for collecting and preserving information, including documents, computer data, audio recordings, objects, and historical artifacts. What matters for me is not that there's an official archive of the foreskin, but rather a method through which to think about a given concept, idea, or thing. From all of this, I began to trace the various discursive tendencies that seemed common to the scholarship. If a study was pro-circumcision, we could expect to find pejorative references to the foreskin. For instance, it's ugly. If the study was pro-foreskin, we would find the foreskin reified, while the biomedical industry was demonized. The debate is polarized. Sides are taken. It often seems as if the scholar must be like George W. Bush, declaring that either you're with us or you're against us, echoing, of course, Jesus Christ's own words in the Gospel of Matthew. And thus the scholar takes a strong position either for or against the foreskin. But what happens to an agnostic researcher, let alone a parent confused about what they should do with their newborn son? When I commenced the study, I was not interested in the division so much as the discourse, the language used, the metaphors deployed, the tweets, the memes, the GIFs that were distributed online. Today, my interest is very much in the division and how the foreskin is represented and understood. Quite simply, what if one just wants to know about the foreskin? This is the question that motivates and inspires Uncut. And the answer is that the foreskin is worthy of study in its own right because it is complex, remarkable, valuable, and I think supremely interesting. Thank you.